So let's start out this segment with a question. Do you personally know anyone who attended the New York World's Fair in 1964 or 1965? I've read books on the subject, articles, watched films, but none are quite as invaluable as actually talking to someone who attended the event. My grandmother, like most grandparents, would often reminisce about things that happened before I was born. Holiday celebrations, how she met my grandfather, and every once in a while, she'd share a little bit about their trip to New York City in 1965. She'd talk about taking her kids on an airplane, walking through the city, and seeing Shea Stadium. In addition to some films taken at the fair, there were also a few mementos of their trip. There's an oversized coloring book, a guide to Sinclair's Dinoland, and a 7-inch vinyl containing one of the catchiest songs of all time.
There is just one moon and one golden sun, and a smile means friendship to everyone. Though the mountains divide and the oceans are wide, it's a small world after all.
The Sherman Brothers are responsible for many of our favorite Disney tracks, but they really outdid themselves when writing the title track for It's a Small World. It's a quintessential part of the ride. Another quintessential part of the ride was the style, or the visual aesthetic. Artist Mary Blair was largely responsible for the endearing look of the attraction. After contributing to films like Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland, and Peter Pan, she'd be enlisted by Disney in order to bring her signature style to the happiest cruise that ever sailed. You know, another important woman in the creation of It's a Small World was the super talented Alice Davis. She was brought in to help bring Blair's vision to life. Specifically, Miss Davis would create over 150 different costumes for all of the animatronic figures appearing in It's a Small World. Oh, and here's one more name that people often forget about when talking about It's a Small World. Actress Joan Crawford. At a time when it was uncertain whether Disney could or should help Pepsi Cola to build an attraction for the New York World's Fair in 1964, some historians credit Miss Crawford for motivating the board members at Pepsi to endorse this project. Stay tuned, because I'll include some commentary from those historians in just a bit. So let's take a moment and celebrate a force of nature in Hollywood, the woman we all know as Joan Crawford, and explore how It's a Small World may not have existed without her influence. But first,
have you noticed? You hear something new at the fountains today.
The lively crowd today agree. Those who think young say Pepsi, please. They pick the right one, a modern light one. Now it's Pepsi. For those who think young.
If you've worked up a mighty thirst, take a break and enjoy a clean, refreshing Pepsi Cola. Pepsi Spark will bring back your energy and taste better cold than any other soft drink in the world. Put it to the the test. Pepsi, for those who think young.
Taste that beats the others cold. Pepsi pours it on.
A certain Miss Lucille Fay LeSueur was born in San Antonio, Texas in 1908. Well, at least according to her own account. While Crawford's gravestone lists 1908 as her date of birth, several resources actually suggest the real date might be a bit earlier in 1906. Regardless, Joan, or rather Lucille, started her acting career during the silent era of film. She signed a contract with MGM Studios, and from what I've read, she earned around $75 a week. Her first credited role was in the film Lady of the Night, serving as a body double for Norma Shearer, which is pretty impressive since during the silent era, Shearer was the bee's knees. A feminist pioneer and early sex symbol of the silver screen who Hollywood couldn't seem to get enough of. Turns out cameras loved Lucille as well, and so did audiences. Soon after, Joan Crawford started getting larger roles, even starring in a few films later in the 20s. Crawford was driven to become a Hollywood starlight. Some would say obsessed. Someone in the industry once said,
"No one decided to make Joan Crawford a star. Joan Crawford became a star because Joan Crawford decided to become a star."
When Hollywood started transitioning into talkies and sound became increasingly more popular, it proved difficult for many actors and actresses to make that transition. Determined to be a star, Crawford wound up being one of the few actresses able to make that change. Of course, it didn't hurt that she was also a talented dancer.
Hurry, not too fast now, Harry.
Crawford must have taken a few lessons from ladies like Norma Shearer, since audiences started to notice the modern sexuality she'd bring to her roles.
This happens to be my room, Mrs. Haynes.
It's yours, yes, for the time being, like everything else you've got. May I suggest if you're dressing to please Stephen? Not that one. He doesn't like such obvious effects.
Thanks for the tip. But when anything I wear doesn't please Stephen, I take it off.
You know, those two leading ladies even co-starred in the 1939 film The Women. Great title, by the way. It's touted as a sensational hit featuring 135 women with nothing on their mind but men.
All right, girls, come on. Come on, you beat everybody now, come on. Jesse, take care of these girls, will you? All right, come on, girls, the beer number.
Hello, Duchess.
Hello, Mr. G. How many nip-ups today? Feel pretty light on my feet.
Crawford would appear opposite leading man Clark Gable in several films. People seemed to enjoy their chemistry on the screen, and that same chemistry seemed to continue off-screen as well, since an alleged affair between Crawford and Gable seemed to have been responsible for her separation and eventual divorce from her first husband, Douglas Fairbanks Jr. She'd marry 3 more times during her life. Crawford's marriage to actor Franchot Tone would last from 1935 till 1939. Her marriage to her third husband, Philip Terry, lasted from 1942 till 1946. Now, up to this point, each of Joan Crawford's husbands were themselves actors in their own rights, and the erratic nature of movie shooting schedules certainly didn't help these unions. Crawford may have recognized the dilemma because in 1955, she was married to her fourth and final husband, businessman Alfred Steele. Steele was incredibly successful in the soft drink industry, having worked as vice president of marketing at the Coca-Cola company for several years before leaving to go to their biggest competitor, Pepsi. By the way, Crawford was no stranger to cola when they met. She already appeared in several Royal Crown advertisements in the 1940s. You know, she must have really loved Steele for her to switch brands. People are pretty loyal to their cola of choice. In fact, Pepsi products can often be seen in several of Crawford's films. According to the New York Times archive, Crawford married Alfred N. Steele, the company's board chairman and chief executive officer. Mr. Steele logged more than 100,000 miles a year in revitalizing the soft drink company's worldwide activities. She started traveling with him, flying to gala openings of new bottling plants and conventions, and serving as hostess of parties on their trips, as well as their spacious East Side Manhattan penthouse. You know, 1955 was a pretty important year, and not just because Joan and Alfred's nuptials, it's also the year Disneyland opened. Pepsi Cola was one of the official sponsors for one of Disneyland's original attractions, the Golden Horseshoe Revue. Pepsi Cola would continue to sponsor the Golden Horseshoe for over 25 years, and during that time, they were able to build a decent relationship with the Walt Disney Company. In 1959, Alfred Steele suffered a heart attack and passed away. That didn't stop Joan from staying on at Pepsi Cola, and she continued to build a reputation in New York as quite a philanthropist. According to the New York Times, Miss Crawford became a leading benefactor, fundraiser, and an honorary official for dozens of charitable organizations, explaining to an interviewer in 1971,
"I've been on the receiving end of so much good that I feel I have to give something back."
In the early 1960s, several notable companies were prepping for something big in Flushing Meadows, New York. Robert Moses, the president of the New York World's Fair, promised an event unlike any other.
We have roamed these United States and literally combed the globe for pavilions and exhibits which will reflect the achievements of all men in industry, culture, the arts, and harmless entertainment. We confidently expect more than 70 million visitors to an unforgettable pageant.
The Coca-Cola company was well on its way with its plans for the fair and expected several thousand visitors to its pavilion. One of the pavilion's highlights would include the Global Holiday, a 15-minute walk that would take fairgoers around the world. This free attraction was planned so that people can see and touch everything and was extremely well received. Time magazine put it on their best of the fair list, and Forbes praised the experience, stating that the walkthrough had an almost magical transition through sights, sounds, and smells. Pepsi-Cola would have to respond with something big in order to stand a chance against their biggest competitor. Unfortunately, Pepsi was dragging their feet, and with less than a year left, they had to decide on something. Now, this story is somewhat controversial and has been scrutinized, so my goal here is to outline what evidence we've encountered and leave it to the viewer to decide whether or not it sounds credible. I first discovered this story back in 2019 while visiting Disney Imagineering in Glendale, California. My wife Marcy Renee and myself were invited to explore their campus with a good friend of ours. Our tour guide on this trip was Michael Iwerk, one of the Imagineers over at Disney, and if his name sounds at all familiar, it's probably because his family has built quite a legacy at the company. The name Iwerk, it's been an institution at Disney for a number of decades, like Leslie Iwerk. She's an extremely talented Oscar-nominated director responsible for both the Pixar story as well as the Imagineering story on Disney+. By the way, there's a really great segment in there about It's a Small World if you have that streaming service. Leslie's father, Don, he was a Disney executive who had his hand on attractions like America the Beautiful and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And of course, there's Ub Iwerk, Walt's closest collaborator at the beginning and the man really responsible for refining the look of the original Mickey Mouse, essentially bringing the character to life. You know, I guess what I'm trying to say here is that the names Iwerk and Disney, they go together like peas and carrots, and we definitely couldn't have asked for a better tour guide while visiting Disney Imagineering. Now, with all the top secret projects they were working on, we couldn't take many videos, but I did get permission to take a handful of pictures. We'd visit the original WED building after their move in 1961, and even got to stand in the room where Walt housed that giant Florida project map you see in all those pictures. Behind the original complex sits Disney's Grand Central Creative Campus, formerly the Grand Central Airport. Now, back in the day, this facility hosted aviation legends like Charles Lindbergh, Amelia Earhart, and Howard Hughes. Hughes even used this complex in his epic film, Hell's Angels. Today, you'll find this really awesome museum alongside several spaces being used for Disney Imagineering. My favorite was the library used for resource material. Some of the books back there were so old, and I really wish I could have spent the entire day digging through those shelves. They had a lot of modern books as well. One that caught my eye was Yesterday's Tomorrow, Disney's Magical Midcentury. If you're not familiar with this book, it's written by the legendary Don Hahn. Don has authored a number of amazing books about Disney, but is probably most well known for producing Beauty and the Beast and The Lion King. Yesterday's Tomorrow contains a number of rarely seen photos and illustrations highlighting Walt Disney's impact on the mid-20th century. It should come as no surprise that there are chapters dedicated to all 4 of Disney's attractions at the New York World's Fair. Now, this is the first time I read about Joan's involvement in the Small World attraction. In the book, it says that Pepsi board members dragged their feet on the decision, and at the last minute, board member Joan Crawford reached out to Walt for help, with just a year left until the opening of the fair. WED was filled to capacity with work for the other 3 pavilions it had committed to, and didn't need the pressure of another. Upon further research, I discovered that author and World Fair historian Bill Cotter offered a similar account. According to Cotter, Imagineers had originally rejected Pepsi's proposal, but when Joan Crawford bumped into Walt at a party afterward, well, it wasn't hard to get Disney obsessed with a new idea. Walt then went to his Imagineers, who were already stretched thin working on the Magic Skyway, the Carousel of Progress, and Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln. He told them about an idea that he had, about a boat ride featuring the children of the world. Can you imagine how the Imagineers responded? I think they thought he lost his marbles, but it wasn't easy to change Walt's mind. And by the time the meeting was done, the Imagineers had their new assignment. Within a month, plans for a 32,000 square foot structure were sent to Pepsi Cola headquarters in New York.
Pepsi Cola presents Walt Disney's It's a Small World, a tribute to UNICEF.
When Disney showed the preliminary plans for the show to the board of directors at Pepsi, the reaction was poor. There's this great interview with Disney legend Joe Fowler where he explains how the meeting went down. Fowler said that when he met with Pepsi's board of directors, it was composed of Joan Crawford and 4 or 5 old gentlemen who had completed their usefulness years previously. According to Yesterday's Tomorrow, once again Joan Crawford stepped in and forced the point, pushing the board to approve of Walt's plan, which they did out of fear that they would have nothing at the fair. Joe Fowler described it a bit differently. He said Joan Crawford stepped in and gave those boys a beautiful dressing down. If you're not familiar with that term, it means the Pepsi board received a severe reprimand.
Get out! Get your things out of here before I throw them into the street and you with them. Get out before I kill you!
What's that for?
I do that in all my pictures.
According to Joe, 10 minutes after Crawford dropped the hammer, the group finalized plans for It's a Small World. In addition, the Pepsi Company would partner with the United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund. When the fair opened on April 22, 1964, It's a Small World was an immediate success. The ride cost 95 cents for adults and 60 cents for children, with the funds going to UNICEF. Over the next 2 years, more than 10 million guests visited the Pepsi Cola Pavilion. The pavilion was one of the top 5 most popular at the fair, and the charming little boat ride owes its creation to several individuals, including a legendary actress by the name of Joan Crawford. So I guess I'd like to thank Miss Crawford for her involvement in creating a quintessential part of Disney history. If you'd like to experience this story for yourself, I'd suggest reading Yesterday's Tomorrow by Don Hahn, or check out Behind the Attractions on Disney+. Bill Cotter also has written several books on the New York World's Fair you'll find enlightening. I'll put some links in the description of this video. I also should thank Elizabeth Specht for fostering my interest in the New York World's Fair, and for being such an amazing role model. With all of the negativity and hate that seems to have become commonplace, especially here on the internet, my grandmother was a wonderful example of grace and civility. Hey, and here's a shout out to my buddy Ryan for loaning us his voice once more. Even though he prefers Coca-Cola, he does have an amazing YouTube channel you should check out. And finally, thank you for checking out this video. If you enjoyed it, please give us a like and consider subscribing to Retro Spectrum so you won't miss a single video highlighting the people of the World's Fair.